One date, two countries across the Indian Ocean, and three separate experiences for its people. We're talking about 26 January, where one country sees parades, patriotic speeches, and a celebration of democracy, while the other, well, that's where things are a little bit complicated. For Australia, it marks a deeper and more complex story, one of gain and loss, of pride and pain, and of a continent forever changed. This is Australia's story. As a storyteller who has lived both these truths, perhaps I can help you understand why this single date carries such different meanings across the Indian Ocean. Good day and namaste. My name is Mitra Desai and you're watching the Mitra Desai Show all the way from Brisbane, Australia. India is my Janmabhoomi. Here, 26 January is the Republic Day. Now, on this day in 1950, India officially became a sovereign republic by adopting its constitution. This obviously marked a transformational moment in the nation's history. Today, 26 January means grand parades on Kartavya Path, tricolor flags painting the skies, and jalebi stalls at every corner. Jubilation is in the air. Here in Australia, 26 January is the Australia Day. Here too, celebrations are aplenty. Backyard barbecues with friends and family, local events and festivals, outdoor concerts, sporting events, even firework displays in cities and towns. But while all this is happening, some are quietly protesting. 26 January is a date that fills me with a complex mix of emotions. To understand why this date creates such different experiences, we need to go a little bit back to understand its history. Now, here's a fact that might surprise you. January 26 was not always Australia Day. In fact, for a long time, Australia didn't have an Australia Day. So yep, all the parties and fireworks that we see now, they're new. In the 1800s, each colony did its own thing. New South Wales marked 26 January as the day the first fleet arrived. Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, different dates, different reasons. So when did Australia finally agree on one date? Was it after it became a federation in 1901? Nope. Try 1994. That's right. For nearly 200 years after the British arrived and colonization began, Australia did not have an Australia Day. And when they picked a date, unfortunately, they picked one that tied to both pride and pain. Picture this. 11 ships, 1,400 people, convicts, marines, officers, all crammed together, crossing the ocean for 8 brutal months. And they weren't even supposed to land where they did. They arrived at Botany Bay on January 18th, 1788. But it was a disaster. Poor soil, no fresh water, and tense encounters with the local Aboriginal people. So Captain Arthur Phillip did what any leader would do. He changed plans. So on January 26, 1788, he sailed further up and they raised the British flag at the Sydney Cove. A simple act, right? But this moment marked the beginning of British colonization and a story that is still unfolding. Now here's something that people don't usually connect with Australia's history. This bit actually starts with the American Revolution. Wait, what? We get to blame the Americans? Well, kind of. After the American Revolution, Britain lost its prized colonies and, more importantly, a place to send its convicts. So Britain's prisons were overflowing. They even used old ships as floating jails called prison hulks. So where do you send your unwanted when America slams the door? Well, you need to find new, empty land. But here's the thing. Australia wasn't just some random discovery. The British already knew about it. Captain James Cook had mapped the eastern coastline in 1770, and he had planted the British flag, naming it New South Wales at the time. But Cook's journals and reports painted a particular picture. Vast open lands, no visible sign of agriculture, no permanent cities like in Europe, and scattered indigenous groups. And that's where the biggest misunderstanding, or was it convenience, comes in. The British embraced the concept of Terra nullius. In Latin, it means nobody's land. To them, land wasn't owned unless it had fences, farms, or European-style settlements. So Indigenous Australians, they did not fit into the narrow definition, despite having complex societies, rich culture for over 65,000 years. No kidding, 65,000 years. So was Australia really empty? Not quite. But to the British, it was empty enough to take. So how do you legally take something that already belongs to someone else? You just pretend it doesn't belong to anyone else. To the British, since the land had no signs of civilization, there was no ownership in the Western legal sense. They could look past the fact that Indigenous Australians had complex systems of law, governance, land management, fire management, trade networks, spiritual dreaming tracks that crisscrossed the entire continent. The British ignored all of this. They used Terra nullius to justify not negotiating treaties, unlike places in New Zealand where they had negotiated the Treaty of Waitangi. So the land was simply declared empty but never uninhabited. Well, sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a musket. It could be something that you can't even see. Just a year after the first fleet arrived, smallpox swept through the Aboriginal communities around Sydney. Mortality rates? They were estimated to be somewhere between 50 to 90% in some areas. Entire clans were wiped out. But here's the mystery. How did the smallpox arrive so quickly? Was it brought unintentionally by the first fleet through contaminated clothing or supplies? Some historians speculate that smallpox was deliberately used as a form of biological warfare, though it remains debated. Regardless of the cause, the impact was catastrophic. Indigenous communities were devastated, leaving survivors vulnerable to displacement and violence. Influenza, measles, tuberculosis, all of them followed in the years to come because they did not have immunity for it. If they didn't die in battle, they were regardless casualties of a disease. When we think of Australia's history, we often skip a chapter, one that's written in blood. It's called the Frontier Wars. Now, these were a series of conflicts between the British settlers and the Indigenous Australians as the colonists expanded inland, spanning over 140 years from the early resistance, led by figures like Pemulwuy in Sydney, to the brutal conflicts in Queensland's pastoral frontiers. This wasn't just isolated skirmishes, it was a war, but no one called it that. You had events like the Black War that went from 1820s to the 30s in Tasmania, which saw systematic violence to remove Indigenous Tasmanians from their land. There was the Myall Creek Massacre in 1838, which was one of the few cases where settlers were actually tried and executed for killing Aboriginal people. The tactics used by Indigenous groups were guerrilla warfare. It's estimated that up to 20,000 Aboriginal peoples were killed and about 2,000 settlers died in these conflicts. But the real casualty? The truth. Because for generations, these wars were erased from the history books. Taking the land wasn't enough. They tried taking the people too. Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families under government policies aimed at assimilation. What was the goal? Well, it was to erase Indigenous languages, traditions, and identities, and raise children in white households or institutions that teach them to reject their culture. Imagine being taken from your family not because of neglect or abuse, but because of who you are. Thousands of children lost their families, languages, and cultural ties. The trauma didn't end there. It passed down through generations, known as the intergenerational trauma. Eventually, in 2008, Australia did say sorry.
To the stolen generations, I say the following. As Prime Minister of Australia, I am sorry. On behalf of the Government of Australia, I am sorry.
But for many, it was just the beginning. Australia now witnesses a powerful cultural resurgence among its Indigenous peoples. Indigenous languages are experiencing a revival, and the resurgence is complemented by a thriving Indigenous art scene. Land right movements are gaining momentum. There's a growing movement challenging the celebration of January 26, and that's particularly notable. Tens of thousands of protesters now attend Invasion Day rallies across the country with a passionate call for justice, recognition, and even reparations. So 26 January, for some, it's a cause of celebration. For others, it's a reminder. But for all of us, it's a chance to learn, reflect, and to ask, What's the kind of story that we want to tell? How do we want to view our past and the future? If this video made you think or gave you a story that you hadn't heard before, make sure you share it and start a conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for stories that matter. Thank you.